Hey everyone! Today we're going way back in time to talk about something super interesting: chariots in ancient China. These weren't just regular carts. They were like the tanks of the ancient world, used in battles to chase enemies, carry archers, and help commanders lead their troops. But over time, they became less useful. So why were they so important, and what led to their downfall? Chariots were first used in China around 1250 BCE, but they became most popular between the 8th and 5th centuries BCE. Back then, China was divided into many states constantly fighting each other. Chariots were more than just war tools. They showed off a person's high status. They were used to smash into enemy lines, help archers move around, or give commanders a fast ride. But as time went on, lighter soldiers on foot and faster cavalry made the heavy chariots less useful. By the 3rd century BCE, chariots were no longer the main stars of the battlefield. It's believed that chariots came to China from Central Asia around the mid-13th century BCE. However, Chinese legends say they were invented locally by the Yellow Emperor or his minister Shi Cheng. What's interesting is that the oldest chariots found in China were already pretty advanced, which makes it seem like the idea came from somewhere else. These early chariots had a rectangular platform on top of a single axle with wheels. A long pole in the middle connected the chariot to the horses. They were built with wood, bamboo, and rattan, and had bronze pieces for important parts like the axle and yoke. At first, only a few wealthy nobles used chariots in battles. The Shang dynasty controlled how they were made, just like they did with weapons. Shang chariots were usually pulled by 2 strong horses, though sometimes 4 were used. These horses were controlled with simple rope bridles, which later became leather and then bronze. The wheels were big, up to 1.5 meters tall, and had 18 spokes, which was larger than wheels used in places like Mycenae or the Near East. The design was unique, with an open front, low sides, and a closed back, making them different from chariots in other cultures. Each chariot usually had 3 crew members: a driver, an archer on the left, and sometimes a soldier with a spear or axe on the right. In the early days, chariots weren't just for fighting. They were also used in ceremonies to show off rulers' power and for hunting. Archaeologists have even found chariots buried in tombs along with horses and equipment, showing how important they were to the people who owned them. Some tombs also show chariots being used for gruesome punishments, like tying criminals to 2 chariots and ripping them apart. During the Western Zhou period from about 1046 to 771 BCE, chariots got some upgrades. Their wheels became bigger and stronger, with more spokes and curved designs for extra strength. Teams of 4 horses became normal, and the chariots were decorated with fancy items like cowrie shells and bronze pieces. Soldiers riding the chariots started wearing armor made of bronze, leather, or lacquered animal hides. Horses sometimes had tiger skin coverings with bronze reinforcements. These changes made chariots heavier and slower, but also more intimidating on the battlefield. By then, they were used more to scare enemies and help commanders direct their troops, rather than just for fighting. At their peak, the Western Zhou military had about 3,000 chariots and 30,000 foot soldiers. Chariots were organized into groups, showing how important they still were. The tradition of burying chariots with wealthy people continued too. One burial site in the Yan state even had 42 chariots and their horses, showing just how much they symbolized wealth and power. And during the Eastern Zhou period, China was full of small, competing states that were constantly fighting to expand their territory. One of the biggest ways they measured military power was by how many war chariots they had. The more chariots a state could bring into battle, the stronger it seemed. This led to an arms race. States kept building and improving their chariots, always trying to outmatch their enemies. For example, in 632 BCE, the state of Qin had 632 chariots. A century later, that number had shot up to 4,900. The state of Qi had only 100 chariots in 720 BCE, but by the early 5th century BCE, they had built up to 4,000. This rapid increase in numbers also pushed advancements in design. Chariots became more stable by shortening the central pole. Wheels had up to 26 spokes for extra strength, and hardened leather was added for better protection. Some even had canopies to block arrows or sharp bronze blades on the wheels to damage enemy forces. Over time, the fancy decorations of earlier chariots disappeared, and they became more focused on function. Lighter chariots were built for chasing down enemies, while heavier ones were designed for direct attacks. A special type called the crow's nest chariot had a raised platform, allowing a commander to see the battlefield better and give orders to his troops. Chariot warriors had to be the best soldiers in the army. The Lu Yu Tao, a military guide from the 5th-3rd centuries BCE, described strict requirements. They had to be under 40 years old, tall, and in top physical shape. They trained to chase galloping horses on foot, jump onto them mid-run, and ride them in all directions. They also had to master using heavy crossbows and fighting from moving chariots. Because they were so important, they were treated well and given special privileges. When it came to battle, chariots were usually arranged in groups of 5, sometimes with their own infantry support. Commanders had different strategies. They could line them up in front of the main army, group them together for a strong central attack, or use them as fast-moving strike forces. However, chariots weren't effective everywhere. They worked best on flat, dry ground. If the battlefield was muddy or full of rocks and holes, chariots could break down or get stuck. Enemy forces often prepared by digging hidden pits or scattering sharp objects to injure the horses. Chariots were also hard to turn quickly, making them vulnerable to enemy attacks if they got trapped. To protect them, each chariot often had a small group of soldiers fighting alongside it. Chariots weren't only used for charging into battle. They also helped transport soldiers, gave commanders a better view of the fight, and served as mobile platforms for archers. However, shooting arrows accurately from a moving chariot was extremely difficult. In desperate situations, armies even used chariots to create defensive barriers, forming walls to shield troops, similar to how settlers in the Wild West used their wagons for protection. Ancient records tell of clever ways chariots were used in battle. In 595 BCE, during the Battle of Pai, chariot skirmishes between the states of Shu and Shun lasted for days before the foot soldiers joined the fight. In 713 BCE, the Cheng army tricked the Yun by pretending to retreat in their chariots, only to turn around and trap them when they let their guard down. In 632 BCE, Duke Wen of Sine used an unusual strategy. He had his chariots drag branches across dry ground to create a massive dust cloud, hiding his troop movements. Another time in 554 BCE, a teen commander loaded chariots with dummies to make his army seem larger, scaring off the enemy. Despite their impressive history, chariots weren't always the key to victory. In 613 BCE, a rebellion in Su managed to defeat an army that included 800 chariots, proving that they weren't unstoppable. Over time, as battle strategies evolved, chariots became less effective. Other civilizations, like Greece and Carthage, had faced the same problem. Without open flat land, chariots could easily be outmaneuvered. Some were adapted into mobile archery platforms or even equipped with large crossbows, but their role in war was shrinking. By 307 BCE, cavalry had entered the battlefield, and chariots were quickly losing importance. Some armies, like those of the Qin Empire, still used them, and they appear in the famous terracotta army of Shi Huangdi. However, their role had changed. Some worked alongside cavalry, while others were simply used to transport officers. The Han dynasty in the 2nd century BCE still had chariots, but by then, they were more of an exception than a major part of warfare.